Well, for more, we're joined from New York by Simon Vozick-Levinson, Deputy Music Editor at Rolling Stone magazine. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me here.
And we're also in the company of France 24's very own Philip Turle. Back in 1998, you go to a Paris hotel and interview Charlie Watts.
That's correct. And it was quite an interview because there were a lot of unexpected events that took place during that interview. Not least of all, we had to cut through tons of red tape around the Rolling Stones legal team to get this interview, and a very officious and rather aggressive lady was there saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't ask this, you can't ask that. And I actually, with the lady who I went in to do the interview with, were rather worried that if we did put a step out of line, we'd have the whole judicial system of the Rolling Stones crashing down on us and taking us to court. So we go in there, we meet Charlie Watts, and Charlie Watts didn't care less about all of that. He was just the average guy you'd go down the pub and have a drink with. And the lady kept coming in and saying, your time is up, you've got to stop. And he kept saying, no, just leave them here. We're having a good time, we'll carry on with the interview. And so instead of being in there for like 15 minutes, I think we spent about an hour with him. So it was all actually quite good fun. And out of all the interviews I've done, and I've done a lot in my career as a journalist, that is one of the interviews that sticks in my mind.
And he tells you in the interview about 1963 when the Stones are founded. Yeah,
he said, and a lot of his bandmates have said that when they joined the Rolling Stones, everyone said, don't do it. You know, this is a ridiculous thing to do. It will never work. And I said, is that what you were told? He said, no, I was a session musician, you know. I played in groups and I did all sorts of things. And I then one of the groups that I played with was the Rolling Stones, but he put it all down to one person, and the one person he said who was responsible for bringing us all together was a very well-known jazz player, blues musician in the British music scene. His name was Alexis Corner, and that was, I think, he was the person that Charlie Watts said was responsible for creating the Rolling Stones.
Alexis, in a way, should have been given the top job at EMI as talent scout, because he had great ears, and he'd pick a band that would play great music. I mean, great, really good music. And that was his thing, you know. So because he was like that, and because he was a forerunner in this genre, which was called rhythm and blues, there was a lot of bands that came to him, like, well, I don't know, but you know, all these people that you met through being in his band. Eric Clapton was one that I met that way, really. And Brian Jones was one. I met Brian at Alexis' house first. Mick sang with us. That's how I knew Mick. He was a guy who sang in the band. And then they got a band going, you know. I met Keith, he came to see him, and they sat in. They used to sit in with the word. You know, so it was like, it was much of a mixture thing then, you know. Music was very much more like, I think now it's a bit cut and dried, really. You know, you've made a hit record before you've even played a note, in a way. You know, it's all signed up. You've got a manager and a roadie. I mean, in those days, it was much looser, and you had to learn what you're doing more. You didn't have a chance to get there. And it's a different world, really.
Much looser. Simon Vozick-Levinson, your thoughts on that? Because there was this distinctive style that Charlie Watts had. Normally, a rock and roll drummer is effectively the timekeeper, and everyone follows his lead, but not with the Rolling Stones.
Yeah, so I think with the Stones, Charlie was that. He was the foundation that the band built on, but he was also so much more. You could hear it in that clip just now, and you could hear it every time he sat down behind the drum kit. He had this incredible sense of gentlemanly style, grace, elegance that really distinguished him from pretty much any other rock drummer, and it was a really unique sound that I think helped the Stones make so many classic songs over the years.
And he said that he would follow Keith Richards' lead on guitar.
That's often true. Yeah, he and Keith had a sort of symbiotic relationship. Each one might have said they were following the other one's lead. I know Keith often talked about how he would look to Charlie for cues and sort of fit the mood of the song. I think they had a really incredible relationship that was reflected in the music.
Philip Turle, we've heard a lot of tributes over the last 24 hours. Here in France, people remember Charlie Watts for coming sometimes with jazz bands and playing at the local jazz clubs here in the French capital.
Yeah, he was a man who had his finger in many pies, I suppose is the best way to put it. And the funny thing about drummers is that if you ask people to name a drummer from a group, I think they're quite hard done by to be able to name a drummer. They could probably think of Ringo Starr, obviously, from the Beatles, or they might think of a Keith Moon from The Who or Cozy Powell. And I think that it's much easier to name a lead singer from a group than maybe a drummer. So if anybody needs to name a drummer, one of the drummers whose name will automatically come up is Charlie Watts. But he was much more than just a drummer. You're right. You know, he loved horses. He was here in France when we did the interview because he was a horse lover and raced horses. He was heads of all sorts of societies for nothing to do with music at all, because music was just a job. Music wasn't his life. Music was something that he did to earn a living, but he had a lot more interests elsewhere.
When I was a kid, that's what I listened to. I don't mean 5 years old, but I mean when I was a teenager. So I don't know, you know, it's just where I came. When I was 17, I came here to see Bud Powell play, and Clark was with him, you know, and that was Mecca, you know, Paris, Kenny Clark, Bud Powell, you know. So, I mean, it's a world that I fell in love with at a young age, and it's one that it's still heaven to me, if there is one. Being on stage at Wembley Stadium is not heaven to me, that's work. And I don't mean physically working, that's what I do for a living, you know. Heaven is sitting watching Bud Powell play.
Simon, your reaction, Charlie Watts there saying, seeing Bud Powell play in Paris is heaven, playing with the Rolling Stones is work. Is it a little bit exaggerating the point?
He said that so many times over the years that for him, being in the world's biggest rock and roll band was just a job. What he really loved was either being in the crowd or even being on stage at a tiny jazz club. And there's some self-deprecation in there, but I also think there's a grain of truth there. I think that Charlie's lifelong love of jazz music informed that incredible restraint and understated style that really set him apart as a drummer.
An understated style that, again, it harks back to the first part of that clip that Philip played for us. This idea that all music is a bit of a mesh, and that it's perhaps more formulaic than it used to be.
Yes, that's interesting. I think many musicians of that generation might say that, but you know, the music that Watts made was timeless, and it's, you know, something that you can listen to the songs that he recorded with the Stones decades ago, and they still sound incredibly fresh now, and I think that'll be true for years to come.
Philip Turle?
You know, François, I started out my early career as a disc jockey playing records on the radio, believe it or not, to get a foothold into broadcasting. And some of the DJs there, we used to talk about, you know, if you were running a disco, which I also did when I was at college, what would you do to get people to dance? And the unanimous reply from all of them was, stick a Rolling Stones record on, that'll get them on the floor. Which ones should we play? Let's play Brown Sugar, that'll get them on the floor. We can play Jumping Jack Flash, that will also get them there. But if you really want them on the floor, put on Satisfaction, they'll all jump up and they'll start dancing. And what do we have in all those records? We have Charlie Watts on the drums. So chapeau to Charlie Watts. I think it'd be sadly missed. This is a whole era that is now seeing the page turning on these groups that were there in the early 60s that created the rock and roll sound, that it was a whole new ball game. And, you know, back in those days, people used to say about the Rolling Stones, and even I remember when I was a child, don't buy those records. Those people, they're all taking drugs. Those people, they're a bad influence on your daughters. And those people, they don't wash at night, you know? So that's terrible. But, of course, now it's become part of folklore and much more readily accepted by all generations. So Simon, that's great in part to Charlie Watts.
You could hear Philip there showing his age. Let me ask you, speaking of age, Simon, the fact that, okay, we knew he'd pulled out already of the upcoming tour of the Rolling Stones. What's your religion when it comes to the fact that they're still touring? Is that good or bad?
I think anyone who's had the chance to see the Stones performing in recent years knows that it's a good thing. I last saw them perform 5 or 6 years ago, and there's an incredible energy that they brought on stage. I think this tour that they're about to launch, there will be a sadness to it without Charlie there, but I for one, am certainly glad that they're still going.
All right, many thanks. Simon Vozick-Levinson, Deputy Music Editor at Rolling Stone Magazine. Thanks for joining us from New York City. I want to thank Philip Turle as well here in the studio.